History of English Literature, Victorian Age, 1830 to 1890. Brief questions with answers. Part A, Episode 1. Question 1. What is the duration of Victorian Age? Answer. Victorian Age falls in between 1830 and 1880. Queen Victoria was the Queen of Great Britain. She ruled over the British Isles. Under her dynamic leadership, English society developed. She was a great patron of art and literature. Question 2. Who are the major Victorian poets? Answer. The major Victorian poets are Lord Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, E.V. Browning, Matthew Arnold, because they have reflected the spirit of the Victorian era in their works. Question 3. Who are the Victorian novelists? Answer. Thomas Hardy, Charles Dickens are the popular novelists of the Victorian era. There are some women novelists like Jane Austen, the Brontes and George Eliot, who also earned popularity side by side their counterpart male novelist. Question 4. Names some women novelists of the Victorian age. Answer. Jane Austen, the Brontes, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, and Mary Ann Evans, who is widely known as George Eliot, are the prominent female novelists of the Victorian age. Question 5. Why is Victorian age called an age of faith and doubt? Answer. Victorian age witnessed the conflict between science and religion. There was controversy between different political ideologies. It was an age of diverse doctrines. The authors of the age reflected the tendencies of the age in their works and tried to bring about reconciliation between these controversial ideas of the age. Hence, the age is known as the age of faith and doubt. Question 6. What do you mean by pre-Raphaelite poetry? Answer. Pre-Raphaelitism was a new movement during the 19th century. Basically, it was a movement of art and painting that appeared before the Italian poet Raphael. The late 19th century Victorian poets rejected the controversy of faith and doubt and tried to revive the romantic spirit in poetry. These poets imitated the pre-Raphaelite poets, and this movement in poetry is known as pre-Raphaelitism. Question 7. Mention some pre-Raphaelite poets. Answer. D.G. Rossetti, C.G. Rossetti, William Morris, Swinburne were some of the Raphaelite poets. The D.G. Rossetti was the founder of pre-Raphaelitism. Answer. Question 8. Name some prose writers of Victorian age. Answer. Thomas Carlyle, Thomas Babington, Macaulay, John Ruskin are some of the prominent prose writers of the Victorian age. Question 9. Mention the name of some political thinkers of the Victorian age. Answer. John Stuart Mill, John Ruskin, Thomas Carlyle were the distinguished political thinkers of the Victorian age. Question 10. Name some political pamphlets of the Victorian age. Answer. On Liberty and Representative Government by John Stuart Mill, Heroes and Hero Worship by Carlyle, The Seven Limbs of Architecture by Ruskin are some of the political, historical and philosophic writings of Victorian age. Question 11. What do you mean by Oxford movement? Answer. Oxford movement is a religious movement of the Victorian age. It was led by John Henry Cardinal Newman. It was a protest against excessive materialism of the Victorian era. Question 12. Who was the founder of the Oxford movement? Answer. John Henry Cardinal Newman was the founder of Oxford movement. He tried to establish the supremacy of Catholicism and bring about a new life of Anglican Church. Question 13. Name some literary critics of the Victorian age. Answer. Matthew Arnold, Charles Dickens are some of the critics of the Victorian age. Arnold wrote The Study of Poetry to define the nature and function of poet and poetry. Dickens' novel presents criticism of Victorian life and society. Question 14. Write down the name of some elegies of Victorian age along with the names of their authors. Answer. Victorian authors were elegiac in mood. For example, Arnold and Tennyson composed some of the finest elegies of the Victorian era. Tennyson composed in memoriam to immortalize his friend Arthur Henry Hallam. Arnold composed dirges to lament for his friend Arthur Hugh Clough and for the loss of values of the Victorian age. Question 15. Who wrote in memoriam? What is the occasion of the poem? Answer. Tennyson wrote in memoriam to glorify his friend Arthur Henry Hallam, who died in 1833. The poem mirrors the soul-searching and doubts caused by the contemporary clash between science and faith. Question 16. Mention the name of the two dramatic monologues of the Victorian age along with the names of their authors. Answer. Dramatic monologues is the popular form of poetry of the Victorian age. Andrea del Sarto by Browning and Ulysses by Tennyson are some of the finest monologues of the Victorian era. Question 17. Who is the author of the book The Origin of Science? The Origin of Species. When was it published? Answer. Charles Darwin is the author of The Origin of Species. This book deals with the evolution of mankind. It created controversy regarding the origin of mankind. It questioned the biblical concept of mankind. It was published on 24 November 1859. Question 18. When did Oxford movement begin? Answer. The Oxford movement was a religious movement of the Victorian era. This movement began in 1833 under the leadership of John Henry Carnival Newman. Question 19. Who were the leaders of Oxford movement? Answer. The Oxford movement was named after Oxford University, where John Cadley, E.V. Pouchet, Newman, and a few others were based when they began their movement. They wrote a number of pieces on religion or tracts to influence people's idea in favor of religion. Question 20 mentions some women novelists of the Victorian age and their works. Answer. Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot are two famous female novelists of the Victorian age. Silas Manor or The Weaver of Raveloe by George Eliot and Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte are two famous novels of the Victorian age. Question 21. Mention some fictionalized characters of the Victorian era. Answer. Victorian age produced a lot of admirable fictionalized characters. Tess by Thomas Hardy and Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte are some enduring characters of the Victorian age. There are some characters like Pip, Oliver, Angle, Claire, Tess, etc. in Victorian fiction. Question 22. Who is known as pessimist in Victorian literature? Answer. Thomas Hardy is called a pessimist for his pessimistic belief. He shows that man suffers due to the circumstantial forces of life and by the dictates of fate. Question 23. Who is called a poet of faith and doubt in Victorian age? Answer. Lord Alfred Tennyson is called a poet of faith and doubt. He is also called a poet of Victorian compromise because he tried to bring about a compromise between science and religion, faith and doubt of the age. Question 24. Who is called the representative poet of spokesman of Victorian age? Answer. Lord Alfred Tennyson is called the representative poet of the Victorian age because he alone represents almost all the characteristics of the Victorian life and society. Regarding his poetry is as good as reading newspapers of the age that gives us the detailed picture of the age. Question 25. What is meant by naughty 90s in the Victorian age? Answer. English literature of the last decade of 19th century is referred to as naughty 90s because it was characterized by a revolt against the tendencies of the early decades of Victorian era. Okay viewers, thank you for watching.